Hello and happy Halloween, everyone. Thank you to all of our online viewers for joining us on today's webcast. My name is Francesca Gargano, and I am the Marketing Specialist here at LookingGlass Cyber Solutions. I'm very excited to introduce today's presentation of Own It, Secure It, Protect It, Zero Trust in the Modern Workplace. In this webinar, our speakers will discuss best practices for zero trust in the workplace and the real-world challenges that zero trust presents. Our LookingGlass presenters for today's session are Eric Olson, Senior Vice President of Product Management, and James Carnall, Senior Vice President of Delivery and Support. Before we begin, I want to very quickly run through some of the housekeeping notes and reminders for BrightTalk webinar platform. Please note on screen that there is a chat window where you should feel free to submit any questions that you may have for our presenters. We will be addressing these questions at the end of today's presentation during the Q&A section. If we happen to run out of time to go through all of the submitted questions, then we will be sure to contact you directly following the presentation. Please note that any questions submitted through the chat feature are only viewed by the presenters and not by fellow audience members. So if you prefer to have a question addressed privately, please indicate so in your comments and we will contact you directly if desired. Also note the attachments and links section to your audience on your audience screen. Lastly, and very importantly, if you would like to obtain 1 hour of CPE credit towards your professional certification for viewing today's webcast and did not happen to enter your membership number when you signed up for this session, please send it to us via the chat window. All you have to do is simply enter your membership number only, and BrightTalk will tell us which viewer it came from. You can enter it at any time during the webcast. So without any further delay, I will go ahead and pass this over to our presenters to kick off today's webcast. Eric and James, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Francesca. I appreciate that. Okay, so for those of you that aren't aware of the Eric and James show in regards to these webinars, we like to keep it high level and hopefully entertaining, at least for us. One of the things that we wanted to caveat today is this is our view of zero trust and us trying to communicate that out. It certainly won't be in the weeds and a particularly technical version of that. Eric, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, hi everybody. Again, for those who don't know, zero trust is in some ways the latest in a long-running history of the Eric and James comedy hour here, which is that we like taking industry buzzwords, disassembling them, and getting to a plain English definition and discussion of what it's all about. As James indicated, this is not meant to be a highly technical webinar, more of an overview and introduction of history, concepts, and understanding zero trust. If you already are trying to figure out which way to manage device and user authentication in a ZT environment, not the right webinar.
Right.
But we certainly have people you could talk to.
Right.
So that kind of brings me to today, to the question of why are we giving today's talk?
Well, other than it's Halloween and we want to scare some people.
Oh, well,
right? I mean,
that goes without saying.
So I hope you've got your best costumes on, and with that we'll get going. So
that's why we're not on the video.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
I'm quite scary.
So the first image you see here on the screen, which I absolutely love, is a talk from this year's RSA conference that says, "No more firewalls, how zero trust is reshaping cybersecurity."
Well, but there's another one too, right? I mean,
right.
There's the same.
Same conference, same stage.
That's not
the fallacy of zero trust. So, like any buzzword,
right.
There's a truth that lies somewhere in between, and we want to talk a little bit about where we see that reality, how zero trust, which we do support, do believe in, and manifests itself in some of our...
Spoiler alert, right?
Yes, manifests itself in some of our offerings, as well as our philosophy as a company and in our product portfolio, which is one of the reasons I'm on the mic today with James. So we'll talk through some of that, which brings me to...
Right, signposts. So we want to go, what is it and what isn't? Certainly the history, we want to go through some assumptions and principles. Theory meets reality. What's the rubber hitting the road? What does it really mean? And then, as Eric mentioned, we want to go into LookingGlass's take on zero trust and how we are helping organizations meet their needs to obviously implement this.
Absolutely.
And then we'll have some Q&A at the end if you haven't eaten too much candy by then. All right, so.
It's a little backwards from usual.
Yeah.
Right? We decided to start with zero trust, what it isn't.
Mm-hmm.
And this is self-evident to any of you who have done any reading on zero trust prior, but I do believe it's always good to start with a definition, make
Right.
sure we start at the beginning. Zero trust is not a turnkey solution. It is not, as you saw, the end of the firewall.
Right.
It is not a new and improved version of some existing product. In fact, now with rainbows, right, as it says, it's not a product on a shelf that you go and buy at all.
Right. And it's certainly not an easy button, right? I mean,
no, it is not.
And again, I was at a conference, just down at Secure World down in Texas, and this question came up, and I almost got roused at by the CISOs in the room, because they're like, when I first heard of this, I thought it was a thing or something I could do or buy or just solve my problem, and in a very animated way, they're like, it's the stuff we should have been doing all the way along, right? So.
Exactly. Which actually brings us to what it is, right? And the way that I think about zero trust is that zero trust is prior to and in addition to implementation. Zero trust is a mindset. It is a framework. It is a set of assumptions. It is a way of thinking. And it is an architecture. This is not something you say, if I activate the new feature on my firewall or implement this new solution from my security provider, I get me some zero trust.
Right.
It is, you do need products and technologies to fulfill the tenets of zero trust. But zero trust itself starts with a set of assumptions and a set of principles and a way of thinking.
All right, so let's go into the history a little bit, Eric, in regards to where this even came from. Where did this buzzword, where did this term come from originally?
Yeah, so great question. There was some foundational work done by a group called the Jericho Forum that is not a direct, progenitor, but there's a lot of really good groundwork laid.
So this has been out there for quite some time.
10 years plus?
Yeah, right.
And then an analyst formerly at Forrester, now I believe at Palo Alto, named John Kinderveg, formalized this set of principles and a set of thinking in which he basically codified in a fairly detailed and technical way. And by the way, that is an actual screenshot of the original paper. And for those of you who would like, as a in our follow-up email after the webinar today, I can certainly provide a link to the original document, which it's sort of another one I've studied. It's sort of like the original Bitcoin paper that Satoshi wrote. Like, if you take all of this back to its roots, there's a 10-page paper you can read that kind of started the snowball down the hill.
Right.
But essentially what it said is, we need to think about security in a fundamentally different way, because the paradigm at the time, which we now all know as ancient history and not reality and doesn't work.
Castle moat type.
Castle moat.
Yep.
And so, I think James and I were discussing before this call, right? Everybody in security knows that this model no longer works. But just to close out kind of the history piece, right? How did the dike start getting all the holes in it that led, I think, to the impetus for zero trust?
Yeah, no, and I think that, again, we've got a list there of the porous nature of the perimeter, right? Is that we needed to let people in, and we typically had people at the gates and guards and what have you. But then we started to open that network, that firewall, that infrastructure up, VPN. We had cloud services. We had mobility, right? We wanted laptops. We went from hard desktops to laptops, things that people could carry around, bringing your device to work, apps and third party, which meant we had to poke holes and open ports and work on protocol, and essentially we extended that perimeter out to the point where we didn't know who was in it and who wasn't.
That's right, and so even before it became, security product buzzwords, the perimeter essentially began to dissolve. And there was recognition, of course, in the industry and on the customer side at the time that this was happening, but it was a little bit of the frog in boiling water, right? It happens 1 degree at a time.
Right.
And so the idea behind zero trust and the framework that it provides was looking, as forward thinkers do,
right,
and saying, if you carry this trend line out a couple of years, what you have is essentially, to use the current phrase, a borderless network.
Right.
And before we get to today's reality, there's just one other slide we have on why the castle and moat thing doesn't work, that is not just about opening holes in the perimeter or the dissolution of the traditional perimeter. Even in the case where the traditional perimeter or castle and moat model was in place and was potentially applicable at the time, here are just 3 statistics out of 3 dozen I reviewed for the webinar. First, 71% of targeted attacks use spear phishing emails. Almost the other 30%, right, are active insiders. Right. And this was one we picked up at our recent customer summit from an actual customer who has a very large workforce and a very robust anti-spear phishing education and safety awareness.
Cyber awareness, right, for last month's program, right?
And basically what they said is there is a small tail of the bell curve that no matter how many times you teach them and
they ain't gonna get it.
They will click on
every time. Right? And again, you need to firewall those people off from the rest of the business as well, right? Knowing that is important.
Exactly. And the upshot of this is that whether it is because an insider has let an outsider in, or because an insider is part of the problem, right? The problem is, it's the assumed compromise, right? There is a boogeyman, whether it's someone who's supposed to be in the building or not, there is a boogeyman in the network. Assume compromise, right? And the other thing is that, castle and moat be damned, right? This is what a network really looks like today, as James said, right? You've got a mixed device environment, operating systems. You've got tablets and phones, company issued and not. You've got laptops, you've got Mac, you've got Windows, you've got Linux, you've got servers, you've got infrastructure as a service, software as a service, cloud providers.
And again, you've got an assumed sort of core, which is we're protected, and then you're bolting all these things on. It's no wonder we can't protect it, because we don't know what's on it half the time, right?
So I heard an amazing statistic. A friend of mine has extensive experience in incident response. And he said, in something like 80% of the cases that he walks into, the first thing he asks for is, what is the current state of the network? How do I get a picture of what's on the network and what it's running? This is, from a security perspective, sort of basic building blocks, right? 80% of the cases, the customer needed a significant period of time to be able to answer that question. In the talk from which this screenshot was borrowed, I credit them at the bottom, the speaker relayed the following related anecdote. When he took over as the CISO of a large global organization, the managed service provider that ran their network for a total cost of several $100 million a year.
Trivial.
And he said to them, how many devices are on my network? And they said, whatever they said, 85,000. And he said, I don't believe you. And he cited all the reasons why, starting with the number of devices was roughly equal to the number of users.
Right.
And all of the studies and statistics tell us we know that that's wrong. The number of devices is slightly larger. Right. I think the current average is approximately 1.5 devices. So through a series of active scans and other tools to gain actual asset visibility, they found they were off by 50%. There were another 30 or 40 or 50,000 devices on the network that the network manager was not aware of. These are really big numbers, and they are making the point that visibility, right, the state of the network, what is on the network, what is it running, and do you have any idea what's on your network or what it's doing, that visibility is an absolute foundation stone to improving security and the reduction of risk, which is really what this is all about, right? At the end of the day, no one said, I saw a great t-shirt at a conference that said, I can't guarantee security, I can only help manage risk. And I think that's actually a great summary of network security and information security in the modern enterprise.
So then next slide, we're talking a little bit about some of the tipping points. So if you say you've got now an environment that is dynamic, that is changing, that we don't actually know what's on the network, We don't know what's connecting to it, how many devices, things like that, the makeup of those devices, or at least we're not managing it well. I think some of the other things is how those areas of the network, or essentially the perimeter, have been taken advantage of. And I think there were a couple of moments, right, in the press that were tipping points that sort of were a wake up, and why we're right now talking about zero trust. And I think one of the first one was one of the big APTs that was advertised was the Aurora operation with Comment Crew that attacked Google and a number of other organizations and government agencies, right? Yep. And that particular event resulted in BeyondCorp being created by Google, right, to sort of address that. And essentially they did. They went to a mindset that, hey, let's assume all our users are on untrusted networks. Let's just pivot and change to the paradigm of zero trust in regards to that. And I think one of the things that shook everybody up is that they did a rip and replace program, and certainly we're not advocating for that, but they have the resources to do something like that. They took it that seriously. They were that, I think, motivated by the fact that they were in cloud and obviously this large company, and that could happen to them, that this was one of those big shakeups. And I think people paid attention and they paid notice.
Yeah, I agree, James. I think this was one of those watershed moments for a couple of reasons. And there are a number of facets to this, so I want to double click on it for a moment. The first is that when a true thought and business leader like Google makes a substantial move, a change in architecture, approach, technology, or mindset, right? The world pays attention and follows. And I think that, for that, it garnered a lot of attention that some organization somewhere, a smaller one perhaps, might have said, I did that 7 years ago. And that may be true, but it doesn't cause a sea change in the industry unless you have one of the 800-pound gorillas, as they say, to blaze the trail in a visibly public way. The other thing that I think is noteworthy, and we'll talk a little more about this in the section on challenges, which is there are very few organizations with the technological ability, the technical acumen, the relatively short history for an enterprise its size, and we'll talk about why that matters, but the relatively short history,
that's a good point,
and the financial wherewithal, and the will to do a rip and replace. So in one sense, they sort of blazed the trail and led the way. In another, they were the exception
maybe
to the rule.
To some of the rules. No, I think that's a very good point you bring up. But they definitely got borderless, and they got the fact that their economy and their workers, their staff, their user base was one. I think the other thing is, and you and I say this a lot, is I think they were surprised by what was infiltrated, right? They were going after their code repository, their asset. They weren't going after money and credit cards and financial.
They can steal that from anybody.
Right, but again, they were going after where it hurt for Google, their IP, right? And that is their crown jewel. So it was very interesting.
So you're kind of our resident historian here. That was followed by a couple of other watershed moments.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So
some big.
What was next from your perspective?
So I think, again, another thing was when you talk about a perimeter and allowing some access that you feel that you are trusting, right? The whole concept of VPNs and the RSA tokens. And I think when that breach and that attack happened, suddenly we had, 40 million users around the world in different systems, government and commercial, that essentially had systems that were exploited, that couldn't be trusted anymore.
That's right.
And it had a big change to the ecosystem, right? It's like, okay, so we've got this going on, and now I can't trust this one thing that I told you I could trust.
Yeah, throw away your key fob.
Exactly.
And this actually begins to bring us around to the zero trust in its literal interpretation, right? Was just because a user is authenticated or on the network, that they are geographically and networkly in the right place, and they have authenticated, does not mean that connection, because connection and device are not necessarily synonymous with user, are to be trusted. which brings us to everybody's favorite go-to headline.
Well, and again, so Target, right, it basically came as a result of a vendor, right, and access to a system that they didn't have direct control over, but they allowed into their ecosystem, right,
Yep.
that essentially resulted in the executives getting fired, right? So it had not only it got the attention of the executive level because there was impact on the C-suite, but it was also a fact of, now my vendors, right? Now I've got my authentication, my firewall, I've got other vendors and systems that are accessing it that I may or may not know what they're doing or how they're doing it. And I'm not profiling the traffic. I'm not limiting what they do. I'm just opening it up saying, I trust you, so come on in, but I don't trust you to have only this transaction, right? They just left it wide open, say, come on in, right? Because we trust you.
Because you've been authenticated,
right.
and spoiler alert, we're coming to core principles for Zero Trust. Last leg of the stool.
Well, and
right,
I think,
on the
22 million people that have background checks and have had people go through and know everything about social security numbers and their family and who they talked to and where they lived and where they went to school, and all of that information potentially, is leaked out from the government. And essentially the U.S. House recommends Zero Trust because we believe, right, in their opinion, that we should assume that nobody on our network should be trusted. And if we move to that as a government, right, as protecting our users and our employees and our staff and the military and law enforcement, this is the way to go. So they have got behind it, and I think that was the last real public push saying, hey, the U.S. government now is saying, this is the direction we need to go.
And where the government goes, vendors follow, because
right.
it's
money in it,
a big pot of money.
Yeah.
Which brings us to the assumptions of Zero Trust.
Okay.
Right?
So you kick us off in regards to always hostile, right?
Yeah. Exactly what you just alluded to, James, which is, right, the assumptions drive the principles drive the technology and the implementation and all the things that follow. So at a very base level, first, we assume compromise. We assume that the network is a hostile environment, and that we assume that if you want to draw the, I suppose still valid, but over time increasingly archaic distinction between internal and external user connection or resource, that internal and external threats exist at all times, right? See earlier slide about you have insider threats, you have insider systems and accounts that have been compromised inadvertently by an insider doing or clicking something dumb, and then you have the classic, I'm going to burrow in from the outside. Any way you slice it, assume that the threats are there, that the network is a hostile environment, and that locality, as I said, whether you are geographically by IP or location or network segment, an internal user or system and have logged in or joined the internal network, that is not sufficient to guarantee trust, and it should not even be sufficient to ensure access to anything more than is absolutely necessary.
Well, and if I may, Eric, I mean, I like to sort of put this in a physical realm, right, which is that, again, we turn up to work and we have our badge, and if you're an employee, you can whiz through the little badge checker that gets you in, and then you tab into your elevator, you tab again into the door of the business. There are different keys for the server room, different badge levels and what have you. We have some guards that escort you, people that challenge you in certain areas. We've got cameras, things like that, right? Whereas if you're a visitor, right, you come in, you get a temporary badge, you can only be and have access to certain spaces, you get escorted through, right? So in the physical world, we're used to this. This is part of every day, right?
Right.
People are used to challenging, and we say, if you see something, say something, and these types of things. And again, just if you sort of apply that sort of thinking into the network area, you're like, why is that connection allowed for all day? That should be a 5-minute transaction or a 2-minute transaction. So anything that goes over that amount of time should be turned off. This system shouldn't be talking to that system and what have you. So it's really that same sort of, in a very basic sense, those physical challenges that we put in place in our workplaces applied to the network.
You're exactly right, James. It would be like going into a highly sensitive or secure type of environment, like a government facility, a military facility, or a commercial facility that does sensitive work, and basically saying as soon as you clear the front door, You have free run of the building, including every back hallway, staircase, and utility room, which is insane.
Right. It wouldn't happen. Right?
It would not happen.
And then our crown jewels are even in a physical safe, even within the building, right?
Right. And so, that brings up another key point, which is basically if you think of a device and a user and a network flow or a session as that person walking through a building, then they must be, one, authorized. That person must be authorized to be where they are and what they are doing, and they have to have authenticated that they are in fact that person, and those are not the same thing. And finally, right, in a network environment, what we're also saying, as networks become elastic, as they flex more and more, they burst and flex and grow and shrink and spin up and spin down on hybrid cloud infrastructure, right. You have to be dynamic in your responses, and your security and your granular access controls and the data that feeds decision-making and alerting or notification of anomalies and risks must be able to respond dynamically. If you have to pass every rule change through a firewall god in a robe who has to bless it, yep. Right? You're dealing with attacks at the speed of light and responses at the speed of fingers.
But it goes back to, again, another thing that comes up quite often as a theme is you have to sit down and understand the business. What do these different systems need to do? What is their focus? What's the priority? And then you profile them based on what they need to do and what they don't need to do. That helps in regards to setting those parameters.
Right, which is, it's like you're lobbing them over the strike zone. Right, which does bring us to, there are some base core principles for the zero trust framework. So first, and we've touched on these, but let's be very explicit. The first is there is strict identity verification, and that is true both from inside and outside the network perimeter. Some organizations, and you'll see some talks on this, the end of the firewall, the end of the perimeter. Some organizations, few, but some, actually do treat all traffic as internet traffic. They handle the security protocols and all the same, right. And are taking the approach that almost irrespective of the point of origin. But all users, sessions, net flows, and devices must be authorized. On a related note, that authentication, it is a foundational principle in zero trust, that single-factor authentication is not sufficient. In fact, it will not meet that bar. Right? So multi-factor authentication is de rigueur, and it is, as I said, it is not just for users. It is for systems as well, right? A system. And to your point, James, that means there is a huge amount of upfront work, which is why it's not an easy button. It's not a bolt-on technology. It is a business question of what users and what systems have the right to be doing what they're doing or touching what they're touching or going where they're going.
For how long?
For how long, at what time.
Right.
One of the things that many older systems do not allow, some newer solutions, including ours, gratuitous plug, right? And we will talk at the end for one slide about our Aeonik security fabric. But a time to live, a TTL, for those granular controls and permissions and conditions and rules and detections and so on, right? There is a temporal component in many cases to when someone or something should be allowed to do something. And so you do need that very, very granular network access and control for both users and systems. So a third principle, again, we've touched on it, but let's use the term of art, the principle of least privileged access. In other words, neither a person nor a system should have access to anything they don't need to do their job. Right?
Good program.
It makes perfect sense when you state it, yet to go back to the Target breach, if the plumbing vendor had only had access to the one system they needed to touch, if they had least privileged access, Target would have not lost 44 million consumer
records. And we see this in spear phishing, right? Why do they go after the executives? Because the assumption is the executives have carte blanche, and they don't need it. Quite often they're not operationally engaged in these systems at all.
That's exactly right. And so a fourth basic tenet is what the Zero Trust Network and a lot of the industry will call micro-segmentation.
Mm-hmm.
And what that really is a fancy word for saying, if in the olden days of yore, right, there was a castle and a town and a wall,
right.
And once you were inside the wall, it was all one big open space.
Walk right through it. Yep.
Micro-segmentation basically says it makes perfect sense, it makes logical sense, it makes business sense. In fact, how could you, speaking at a logical, theoretical level, how could you not have separate controls and rules and authentication and hark who goes there
right.
in front of the bank versus the grocery store versus the jewelry store versus the garbage dump, right? And micro-segmentation is all about carving up the network into smaller zones and having different granular access controls and rules for based on what is in there, what role it plays in the business, how sensitive or critical it is, and who and what should have the right to touch it.
And it limits the actor, internal or external, from moving easily from one, laterally through the network or through the organization. Right?
100%. I mean, it's 2019, and at least the last Verizon, annual breach report
right.
summary that I read said, even today, even in large, well-staffed and well-funded enterprises, right, lateral movement is often unimpeded. In the postmortem after a major event, they find once access was gained,
mm-hmm.
by direct hack, by spear phishing, by whatever means,
mm-hmm.
once access was gained inside the environment, inside the entity, the organization, the dwell times and the span of lateral movement are enormous.
Mm-hmm.
And so microsegmentation and granular controls
mm-hmm.
combined with least privileged access,
mm-hmm.
multi-factor authentication, and strictly enforced authentication of
mm-hmm.
users and devices, right? You see how if you put all of these
yes.
things together, that kind of, now I'm in, I have free reign to roam
right.
about the organization, should not happen, but it does.
And we've talked about network segmentation in a couple of webinars that we did ago in regards to, it was a basic principle in the day, but I think part of it is hardware and cost of infrastructure has forced individuals to say, I can only afford this many, firewalls, so therefore I'll set up my network to build around what I can afford, not what I actually need.
Right, and as we go hybrid, right, which means half my computers, half someone else's computers, right, and my stuff zips back and forth over a wire, that need for microsegmentation increases, right, as we become the ever more connected enterprise. Yep. The flip side is the ability to enforce those granular controls, to put those differing permissions and security controls, and in many cases, actual physical devices in 100 places where I used to need them in 4 because I had 4 internet gateways for my whole enterprise, right? That microsegmentation can lead to a spin up in costs, which we'll talk about.
All right.
So this is great.
In theory and principle and practice, right?
The Russians have a saying when you say, well, in principle, and then you make some statement, they say, principle sounds like a nice place, but I've never been there, right? Or as Mike Tyson famously put it, everybody's got a plan till I punch him in the face. So let's talk about how, the rubber meets the road in the real world. And I think in Francesca's description, she said something about, tales from the trenches or, where all of this crashes into reality. There are many, but let's just talk about 3 of them because we are by no means saying this is a panacea and click here, right?
Yeah. All right, so the first.
People.
It's the people.
They're always the problem in security.
They're the weakest link, right?
So vote them all off the island. So in especially in a large organization, right? If you take as a given the principles of least privilege access, of what do they need to do their jobs, and what should this system or this device and the person who runs it be allowed to access? Well, you're constantly churning people on and off from an employment perspective.
Yeah.
You are bringing in contractors, right, to
yes,
do certain jobs who have very specific things they're supposed to do, like write half of an application in concert with your internal team who's working on the other half.
Right.
But your team's in New Jersey and their team's in Bangalore, right? But the other thing that also happens in large organizations is internal movement. People get promoted, people change departments, they move, they change offices, right? So it is great to be able to say, well, users go into groups, and groups have access control privileges, and these groups align to these systems, role-based access management, right? But in a large organization, you can have dozens or hundreds of people changing groups and roles and permissions
all the time.
at a time. So this is, this is also not just a security thing, as I heard a CISO put it. If you've got a team from Accenture who show up on Monday morning and you're 3 days late getting those 10 people's Accenture laptops authorized on the network, well, I don't know what a fancy Big Four consultant costs today, but let's say it's $1,000 per person per day. You've just blown 30 grand because you didn't get them connected till Thursday morning, and they're sitting around billing you and going to Starbucks. So the reality, right? One of the places rubber meets the road is the dynamic nature, especially in large organizations, of actually managing and understanding users and roles and permissions and role-based access in a dynamic people environment where the people are constantly going in, out, or moving.
Yep. All right. So that looks like new technology.
Wait, you don't like tape drives?
Tape drives are awesome. You can carry them in your bag.
So
suitcase.
Legacy.
Yes.
Right? And this is
your Google example a little bit.
Exactly. I said we'd do a callback here, like like a comedian on HBO. So one of the things I think that worked in Google's favor, aside from being incredibly smart, incredibly technical, and incredibly wealthy, right, was the fact that, just my opinion, their relatively short history. I mean, there are banks and pharmaceutical companies and infrastructure companies that are running, mainframe systems and transaction systems and industrial control systems that date to the space program, right? The first space program, right? And so there are systems that simply cannot produce the data, cannot connect to the rest of the environment. They don't have any API interfaces. They can't be integrated into a zero trust fabric or environment. So you have options for how to deal with that in a zero trust environment. But the first thing is you have to recognize that it's a thing.
Yep.
You have to identify those systems and, based on prioritization of people and money and time, which ones present a business risk. Right? If that system is 40 years old, but all it does is order the toilet paper, who cares?
Right.
Right? But you do have options, right? Obviously, you can upgrade, but in the real world, I literally have customers said to me, yeah, we're on a 10-year plan to replace that system because until 2025 at least, it can never go down and it can never go offline, and it will take us that long to build and test something that will replace it. You can isolate it through microsegmentation, and you can put granular controls, if necessary, devices or whatever, in front of it or around it. You can also, this is a bit of a corner case, but in some of our work in the government in the past, I believe we've actually used one-way diodes, so that essentially data can flow out of a device or system to, say, a repository or a database, but nothing can ever come in. Or you can log in to alter it, but no data can leave ever. And that's literally a physical connection.
And I guess, Eric, this is one of the head scratches for most people, right? It becomes a little overwhelming when you think about zero trust because you can't implement a lot of the cool tech around these problems, right?
That's exactly right. And to go from conceptual to granular, I love this example.
Real case.
Yeah, real-world case study. Another related but slightly different where the rubber meets the road, right, is a system that theoretically could be patched, but in reality cannot be patched. And so...
so what are we looking at here?
You are looking at an electron microscope. And the anecdotal example that I heard was, so the CISO arrives in this organization and he says, out of the not 90 but 150,000 devices that are actually running here, this same talk, which was really wonderful, at RSA this past spring, and he said there were, I think it was 8 Windows XP computers still running in the enterprise.
8, wow.
XP.
Mm-hmm.
And so he said, look, this is so insecure and so small in scope that he said, I literally decided to pick up the phone and call the business owner, operator, the person who owned,
responsible for it, yeah.
who's responsible for this XP laptop or desktop, and said, I'll pay for it out of my budget. Can I please get this thing off the network?
Can I upgrade you, please? Yeah.
And what came back in this case was, we've got a $2 million piece of medical gear here that can only talk to an antiquated, unpatched 32-bit version of Windows, and if you change the laptop, you kill the $2 million piece of gear. Because the vendor that made the $2 million piece of gear was out of business, so there are no upgrades for that device either.
Mm-hmm.
And so, to encapsulate it, put controls around it, put a diode on it. The solution here was very, very simple. They bought a tiny bandwidth, as in you said, a $2,000 Cisco PIX firewall, and said, this machine can speak to only that machine, only this way, and nothing else
on
ever.
that port and this period of time, all that very, very discrete sort of.
So you don't eliminate the system,
mm-hmm.
you put in a compensating control that you can demonstrate mitigates. Mm-hmm. You can't eliminate the risk, so you mitigate the risk.
Right, which is still zero trust, because you're managing it, you're identifying it, you understand what's in your network, and you're profiling the sort of traffic that you would expect to see over that.
And nothing else is permitted by device or user, or in this case probably port, protocol, volume, etc.
Did look like the machine that went ping, by the way.
It did. That's our monthly Monty Python reference.
And who's this charming chap? I've seen him before.
So, you know, I believe, and I think I can say the philosophy here at LookingGlass is, but I'm a big believer in the old chestnut that a problem well defined is half solved. And so, to begin to come round at last to where we began, right? Zero trust, again, this is a primer, this is an introduction session. We have very technical people who would love to talk to you about it. But our take, which leads to our view on it, and from that to our play in this space, our offering, which is not a one-product solution to all things zero trust, but it is built on that assumption that a problem well-defined is half solved. If you accept the conditions that led to the impetus for zero trust, if you then accept the assumptions that zero trust makes, that the network is hostile, that the boogeyman is in, etc., that we covered, and if you then accept as a result of those conditions the core tenets, you must multi-factor authenticate every user, every device. All traffic must be authorized and authenticated or is not to be trusted, etc. That in order to the story about 85,000 devices, right? Mm-hmm. In order to implement controls, in order to successfully implement zero trust, you must understand what is on your network in order to protect it. Mm-hmm. In order to create the rules and granular controls that provide reduced risk, which is what this is. I don't guarantee security, I only help mitigate risk, right? Right. You have to understand the value, importance, and criticality and business role of the things you are protecting, which means, you know, this is not an IT problem. This is not a security team problem. Yes. You have to work with the business for two reasons. One, the business can provide the context that contains the blueprints for the stealth fighter and that contains the orders for the toilet paper, and you should not treat those two as equivalent.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Here's the other thing that I think as security professionals, and I've validated this over the years with a lot of our customers, who by and large are security professionals, who report to business people. The other reason that partnership with the business is so important is, you know, as I say, woe betide the security person who becomes the department of no. You do not stand in front of the business train and shout, stop, right? You cannot stand between an outside vendor and an internal system where millions of dollars of revenue are trading hands every minute, and say, we have to turn that off for a few hours. That doesn't happen, right? And one of the barriers that is not a zero trust thing, but is worth mentioning, is part of that process, working through that process, is finding a common language. That the business people and the security people, you know, as I like to say, the security people walk into the room and say 10110, and the business people say dollars, cents, profit. And I believe that interpreter, that translation layer, is risk. That's how security people and business people come together. So if you define the problem correctly, I think that really is a problem half solved.
Very good. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about our take on it in regards to how we are going to enable and help organizations address their need to implement zero trust.
Sure. Every vendor webinar includes at least a small gratuitous plug at the end, right? So, you know, I think this is actually the right context for our Aeonik security fabric and to help folks understand what that is. And certainly there are webinars available and material on our website about the architecture and the product and how it's implemented and so on. But basically what Aeonik is a fabric architecture. What that means is that it was built for micro-segmented environments. It was built for software-defined networks, and it works on a controller and network node architecture. And it is software, which means that you can distribute it in more places. You don't have to buy, I mean, it has to run on something, but it runs on commodity compute, cloud, virtual, metal.
You pick. You pick your brand of choice.
And you can put it scales, so you can put it in front of the one laptop that requires almost no throughput,
right,
and has totally unique rules for literally the two machines sitting in that room. You can deploy it internally or at the perimeter or both, so you can inspect east, west, and north-south traffic as you wish, which can help with enforcing segmentation and help with visibility for lateral movement. As a byproduct of the way the fabric is architected and the data that it generates, you get passive visibility into the assets on your network. In other words, every time a machine talks, it's logged. So the question of what's on my network, well, if it speaks at all,
you know it's
there, and you know what it is, and you know what it's running. And it gives you the ability to do two other things that are hugely important. One is to define the rules, the controls, the policies for each of those segments or points in the network where you wish to impose those granular controls that we just spent 40 minutes talking about. The other thing it does, in the same fabric, because the more point solutions you have to buy and stitch together with Python scripts, the worse it is and the more brittle it is, right? And that's the bane of every security stack, is it allows you to enforce those rules and policies in line on the wire, right? So you don't just get an alert in the SIM that says, oh, 4 minutes ago something really bad happened, and now you should go check it out. You have the option with the Aeonik security fabric to automate responses to untrusted connections, to anomalous behavior, to suspect users. You can build behavioral, not just signature-based profiles, and you can notify or detect. You can also reroute, stop, quarantine, or transfer the traffic so that you can actually do, it's the old, if you see something, say something. Too many of the technologies that, and we have done this work through our earlier hardware-based solutions for literally decades now, in some of the country's most advanced networks and the government's most advanced places.
So this is well tested. This is not us just.
We didn't pull this out of our ear.
Right.
But to sort of finish where we started, you need the visibility. You need the ability to create granular controls and rules and policies. You need the ability to see when they are being violated or something is anomalous. And ideally, we believe, and that's why we built the product this way, it gives you the ability to act. And so this is not a one-in-all-things solution. You still have the need for multi-factor authentication. You still have all of the business drivers and organizational steps that need to happen. But Aeonik is designed and was built from day one to live in this environment and to actually enable exactly the things, at least many of the things, that Zero Trust dictates.
So again, from an architecture point of view, it maps nicely to Zero Trust architecture, the model, and it can find its place in that quite nicely.
That's exactly right.
All right, so I think we're just about there. Get them trick-or-treating, so start getting your costumes on. But we just wanted to go through and just summarize, the key areas of our webinar with you before we let you go.
Yep. So to recap, ticking off on roughly one hand worth of fingers, it's not a product, it's not a service or a technology. It is first and foremost a method, a framework, and a mindset. Another thing that James touched on is the users, right? Their awareness, their understanding, their familiarity with. We wouldn't let you move through the Pentagon with all the doors open, or our research labs without badging and retina checks and whatever everywhere, right? Your users should be informed, should be educated. It should be part of it. Just like anti-phishing, don't click on that training, right? Understanding the...
They should adopt the Zero Trust methodology, right?
And mindset as part of the solution. This is not an IT question. How you implement those granular controls, what rules you place, how you do all of the things that Zero Trust advocates should be driven by and in concert with a view of the business. I had played with and then removed a slide, which was a picture of a spoon and an elephant.
Right.
But this is an illusion deal.
How do you eat an elephant?
One spoon at a time, exactly. So this is a long and probably never-ending journey.
Yeah, I would say
so do not believe anyone. I mean, anyone who says, oh, I can do Zero Trust as a managed service, right, or whatever. It's not a service or a product. It is first and foremost an approach which vendors and certain technologies and certain products can help implement and turn into reality. But it is a long, complicated journey, not just technologically, but organizationally. Next, as I touched on, this was what informed our architectural approach to the Aeonik Security Fabric product or offering. In order to implement any of these pie-in-the-sky concepts, you must have visibility into what is going on your network, and you must have the ability to detect and potentially respond to anomalous behavior, strange or peculiar happenings, violations of policy, and so on. And finally, all of that must be done in the context of, hey, it's great that you have a magic thing that if it sees the wrong thing, it slams the door. But you must do it in partnership with the business, because if you impede the flow of business, watch how fast your solution gets defunded. Right? Woe betide the security guy when the CEO says, why can't I get to Facebook anymore? Oh, that's our new WAF, our new web firewall. Yeah, out.
Yeah.
So hopefully those are some of the key takeaways that you can kind of take in summary from our talk here. Again, not a technical primer, just an overview of the concept, the framework, how it arose, and our take that it is valuable. We absolutely believe in it. We have some solutions that can help, and we hope that's been a useful first look.
So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. I really do hope that helped put Zero Trust in some additional context for you. Certainly, again, as Eric said, we're very supportive of it, but it is a long-term plan, program, architecture. Certainly happy, with the services and products that we have here at LookingGlass to help with that. But with that, Francesco, I think we'll pass it back to you for any last moment follow-ups or questions.
All right, thank you, Eric and James. Looks like we don't have any questions from the audience, so if you think of something, you can put it in there and we can respond to you at a later time over email. So once again, thanks everyone for attending the webcast. A link to the recording of today's webinar will be sent out to you following the webcast and also will be made available on our website under our webinars page for additional viewing. Feel free to pass this along and share this presentation with your colleagues. And thanks for viewing and happy Halloween, everyone.
Happy Halloween.
Happy
Thank
Halloween.
you very much.
Cheers.
Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.